Welcome to the Massage and Mind podcast. Today with Jon Rappoport, Pulitzer Prize nominee and author of The Mysterious. And yes, Jon, my first question to you is, I think what fascinates me the most is how you speak with such natural authority and confidence on the paranormal. And how does this, or where does this come from?
Well, it comes from personal experience, for one, and also from working with clients in my consulting practice. So I've seen it. I've seen it in action, and so it's just something that I can't deny. It happens, and I don't see any reason to try to beat around the bush with it. So I guess that's where it comes from.
One or two examples from your private practice?
Well, for example, a client who eventually began to develop some predictive capacity, shall we say, which some people would call seeing into the future. He was able to see certain events before they happened, and they were pretty specific, so it wasn't just some vague thought. And this wasn't something that we were aiming for. It just happened. And then he got back to me and we spoke about it. He explained what had happened to him, how these events had actually come to pass. And the way that he described it was that he himself was, pretty okay with it. I mean, it wasn't some sort of thing that pushed him back on his heels and staggered him, because what he saw was very real before it happened. And so he kind of assumed that it was going to happen, and it did. In another case, a client, some people wouldn't call this particularly paranormal, but he was working in a company, a fairly large company, and he was having problems and so forth. And through doing some of my imagination exercises, he began to see how he could change not just his attitude, but his very presence, his, I don't want to say exactly persona or role, but it was related to that. In a sense, he could recreate himself without being false to himself. He could become more of what he already was. And this happened very quickly. And as a result of this, all these problems went away completely. So this was a non-rational promotion, so to speak. And he was promoted several times as a result of this. It wasn't something he figured out, if I say this or do that, then people will be more agreeable. It was just a kind of a leap. It was a creative leap within himself. And then everything just turned around. The problems dissolved, they went away as if they had never existed. And he felt much more comfortable working there and happier. And it was noticed. And subsequently, he rose to a much higher position in his work. So those are a couple of examples. I've had a few people who began to develop telepathic skills in the sense that they were able to see or hear or sense what other people were doing, thinking, contemplating. And this was, again, very spontaneous. we weren't trying to accomplish this. Excuse me. We were working in the area of imagination. And it seemed to be a natural outcome, working with imagination. And then that led in these particular cases to a telepathic understanding of other people.
Okay, and how do you work with the imagination?
Well, in my collection called Exit from the Matrix, there are, I would estimate, something on the order of 60 or 70 different imagination exercises. And they have variations. That's why I don't have a specific number. When I work with clients, the whole point is to discover where they're coming from, so to speak, what they want, what they're looking for, what they're trying to accomplish, how they see their situation in life. And to see this in a well-rounded way, so that I can then say, okay, look, here's an exercise that I think you ought to try. And here's another one. And here's how you do them. In other words, fit the exercises to the person in that way. And of course, that relies on my ability to get a very strong sense of who these people are, what they want, where they're coming from, their focus, their desires. And once that becomes clear to me, which often happens fairly quickly, then I can find the right exercises and techniques for them to do that will hopefully move them closer to achieving what they want.
Okay. And another question, when you're working with clients, I'm sure you've heard of the phenomenon of projection, this negative transference. Can you say something to this?
I've never seen it happen. This is a psychoanalytic term from Freud, where because the slant of the psychoanalyst has a great deal to do with parents, father, mother, and the Oedipus or Electra complex. I mean, this is where all of that focuses. So it's not surprising that the patient is then going to perhaps transfer some of his attitudes toward his own parents and put them on the therapist or the psychoanalyst. Although, I have to say, I think that whole concept of transference is very much overblown. In other words, I think sometimes the analyst believes that he's the recipient of transference when it's not really happening at all. Instead, what's happening is that the patient is expressing genuine emotion, which the psychoanalyst then interprets as being the kind of emotion that a child would express toward a father or mother or something like that. And that's a misreading of the situation. To me, it's actually a way of doing less authentic work than the therapist ought to be doing. In other words, if a person's expressing emotion, that's what's going on. And to automatically interpret that or assume that it's all about transference and then deducing from there what ought to happen next in the session, to me can be a very big mistake, because it tends to throw the patient back into acting in childish ways, because that's the lens through which the analyst is looking at things. And I think, as I say, that that's very much overblown. I mean, sure, it could happen, especially given the bias, the initial bias of the therapy itself. But in an ordinary relationship or in, consultant and client, I don't think so. I don't see that.
Okay.
Uh, because we're involved with other issues entirely.
And what would you say what one could do with this emotion that's getting that's shown?
I'm not sure I understand.
Like when a client is showing this emotion that then the analyst is interpreting as something childish. But if this emotion is coming up, like what would you do? Like what?
I see. Well, I wouldn't be the analyst to begin with,
Yes.
so that would be off the table completely. I mean, I wouldn't be in that situation because I don't believe in that kind of work. Um, but if I had a client who was expressing emotion, that's just what's happening, But that doesn't become the focus. That doesn't become, oh, well, this is, and now we have to deal with that in some way. Not at all. Not at all. It could be, for example, just a venting of frustration that the person is not getting where they want to go in life. Well, why not? Why wouldn't you expect now and then something like that to be happening? But I also have to say here that in my work, I'm very much operating from the positive side of things. In other words, how can we shift everything into a positive gear? Not just by thinking positive thoughts, that's not it either, but by, for example, doing certain exercises that are going to get the person to realize that they have left part of themselves in the lurch, so to speak, and that they can recapture that and be more of what they actually are. So that's really the focus. And in that setting, you certainly wouldn't want to take some venting of frustration as an indication of something highly significant that needs to be addressed directly and let's work with this and that's not it.
Okay. So when you say you're like trying to bring the person to his bigger self, or however to call it, then to my mind comes that you were also talking about that people can kind of create their own yoga or whatever.
Yes, I don't know whether I would call it their own yoga, but their own future. They can create their own future. They can create their own reality in much larger terms than they previously thought, based upon what is it that they really want.
So that
That's a question that a lot of people can't answer if you ask it in a very direct way. If you walk down the street and somehow you could engage a bunch of different people and you said, look, I just want to know, you know, what do you really want? And if the person could deal with that question at all, not just in a superficial way, then I think in many cases, you would not be able to get an answer from them right away. They wouldn't know. So that's called the clue. If a person is living his life and at the same time doesn't really know what he really wants, then the life that he's living is not going to be satisfying. How could it be?
So what to do about this if you don't know it?
Got to find out. I mean, when I work with people who come in with that question, that's the big one, staring them in the face, that's where we go. And again, I might give them a technique or an exercise or two that might spring the answer to that question out of the hopper so that they could look at it, see it, work with it, realize, okay, this is what I really want. Well, okay. Now the question becomes, okay, so are you ready to go get it? And if so, how? In some cases, people already, when I work with them, they already know this is what I really want. What I really need to know is, how do I get there from here? So that's where we go. That's what we work on.
And so you find like the first steps the people can easily take, and then from there on things develop.
You mean if they already know what they really want?
If they already know what they think they want,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, it depends on the person. It might be fairly simple and straightforward, or it might not. It depends on what that thing is, for example. It might be a very big, big thing, And then in other cases, a person might have some confusions and lack of knowledge about building a road to get there. So, I find these things out. What is it? What's the obstruction? What's the problem? Or what are the problems? Or what are the confusions here?
Yeah, what can a confusion be?
Well, let's take the case of a writer, for example. Let's say that the person, not only knows that he wants to be a writer, but he is writing. That's not always the case, but let's say it is. And he's turning out pages. He's really doing it. Now the thing that he wants is to get published. Very practical in that case, but is completely confused about what to do, how to go about it. So, okay, what's the plan going to be? What advice can I offer? What do I know? What can I do to help? And obviously, I'm not a wizard on every plan to get from where a person is to where they want to go, because there could be hundreds of different destinations for hundreds of different people involving different lines of approach and work and so forth. So when I don't know, I don't know. And I tell them that, But more often than not, there are suggestions that I can make that are useful, because by engaging in dialogue with the person, they begin to discover things that they knew that they didn't know they knew. They begin to say things like, oh yeah, well, I could actually, yeah, I could do that. All right, write that down. All right. And we keep talking and so forth. And before you know it, the person's got 4 or 5 things that they could definitely do and should definitely do to get from where they are to where they want to go. That happens some of the time, maybe even frequently. I don't keep score. But you'd be surprised at what people can unearth in the process of dialogue that begins to solve the confusion.
When you just sit down with somebody and talk?
Yeah, when you just sit down with somebody and talk. That's right. Because a certain percentage of the time, people do in fact know something about what they ought to do to get from where they are to where they want to go. But they're sort of blocking themselves off from seeing it because they may have some, for example, doubts about whether they can really pull it off or not, whether they can really do it or not.
So you sometimes like throw them in the cold water?
No, I throw them in the cold water. We talk. And then these things emerge. Well, I was talking to somebody last week who has a friend who's in the same line of work that I'm in or want to get into, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. And I say, well, do you think that's a good connection? Yeah, could be. All right. All right. Let's write that down or make sure you remember that. All right. What else, might you be doing to get from where you are to where you want to go? And of course, by this time, I understand some of the specifics, so I'm not just, mouthing that general question. We're getting down into details because with this particular client, that's where we need to go. And sometimes they will say things that make me go, oh, yeah, I understand now. Okay, so this is the way you would proceed, or one would proceed in this line of work. Okay, well, here's a suggestion. What is this? The person, yeah, that might help. Okay, so that's two things now. And before you know it, you got 5, 6 different things that they ought to be doing, and they recognize that in order to achieve their goal. Yeah, just through conversation. But it's not just aimless blabbing, you know, and it's not deep therapy, and it's not throwing them into the cold water. It's good conversation. It's good dialogue. A consultant needs to be able to engage in that kind of thing with people they work with. I mean, there are some consultants who, their method of working is to impose a complete structure on the client. That's where they're coming from. And that's how they operate. Okay, now that you've enrolled in my program, here are the things. Here's the pattern. Here's the system. Here's what you do. Here's the outline. Here's the roadmap. Regardless of who you are or what you want, I'm going to impose this structure on you. Well, I don't agree with that.
And that's
Every person is different.
So because this would lead you back down the Freud line. You're having like the structure you're operating from, and you're always going.
Well, it would be analogous to that. It wouldn't lead you down that specific line.
Yeah.
Freud, but it would be an analogy, a similar kind of thing where you as an authority figure, are now telling the person or steering the person into a certain pocket where you say, as the authority, here's the story. I'm giving you the goods. And, this is the system, the structure, the roadmap, the blueprint for everybody. Well, that's not conversation. That's not dialogue. That's not engagement. That's not being in the moment. That's being, I don't know, an authority is what that is. And in my experience, that doesn't work. And it's insulting to boot.
Okay. Now I have some kind of non sequitur for you.
Sure.
because I hand the microphone over to a friend who's in the room.
All right.
Who wants to ask a question?
Sure.
Hi, John. This is
Hi.
Chris. Well, my question would be totally non sequitur. Where do you see the alternative community go in the alternative arena? Because what I see is that things like Project Camelot have come up, Project Avalon, and many topics that have been very much under the radar and in a small conspiracy circle have been circulated very widely. And now I see that there seems to be sometimes some kind of addiction that is that new stories are being fed to this community that have kind of the same thrill to it, but they seem to not lead anywhere. And where the counterculture now is coming from, where it is going, what are practical steps to do to implement like a new paradigm of living that is based on certainly some of the knowledge that is in the alternative arena about, say, politics, finances, but also about the nature of consciousness, for example, the magical capabilities that we all have.
Okay, well, that's about 6 questions, and it would take me maybe 3 or 4 hours to give you a complete rundown, but I don't know much, if anything, about those particular projects you mentioned. Occasionally, I'll get an email that refers to something or other, but I understand what you're talking about. There are people, for example, who will say that let's say, for example, the great thing is about to happen. Okay, whatever that is. And there are different people, different versions of that. You know, the guys from the Orion Belt are arriving next Tuesday at 4:00, and they're going to settle everything once and for all. So get ready. Or something like that. You know, something wild and woolly, right? And then it doesn't happen. And then, but that doesn't make these people go away. It only makes them redouble their efforts and explain or just, and then there's a new rescue from above about to happen.
Okay.
I don't have very much interest in any of that stuff for various reasons. It doesn't appeal to me, doesn't make a lot of sense, so I pretty much ignore that. And I think that for some people, it has a negative effect because they see themselves as the fortunate passive recipients of a great gift that is coming down the pipeline, about which they don't need to do anything. And to me, that's not a good thing. Just isn't, period. Now, as far as this community that you're talking about, it's so diverse and so different in different aspects and so forth that I don't see some sort of gigantic cooperative enterprise that is going to formulate a plan that is going to install a better system for the entire planet. I just don't see that happening that way. I do see that every individual has an enormous amount of power and capability, creative capability. And when several such individuals, for example, who already know this about themselves, join together and decide they want to do something very, very positive upon which they authentically agree without any kind of coercion or sacrifice of their own point of view, there is no ceiling on what they can accomplish for the good in whatever that thing is that they decide to do. And if there were many such small groups, each doing that kind of thing that I just sketched out, all sorts of very beneficial things could be happening in the world that are not yet happening or that are only beginning to happen. So I don't see, say you had a strategy. Well, let's seek out the common denominators of all of these groups within the quote alternative community, and let's mobilize everybody somehow to come to the table and agree on a particular agenda, and then we march forward. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not saying it's impossible. If somebody truly of tremendous capacity believes that that's the way to go, more power to you. It's not my bent to operate that way. And based on my experience with various groups over the years in observing them and seeing what happens to them and so forth, my sense is that these groups inevitably crash and burn because they get into internal problems among themselves that ultimately come down to the fact that the individuals in these groups do not all or most of them see themselves as strong, capable, independent thinking, creative, powerful individuals. And therefore, problems are going to develop, as in followers versus leaders, all of the usual crap that comes up that derails whatever good this group might do. So, but I do see, for example, on the internet, that many, many people all over the world are waking up to all sorts of things, good things. My work is about trying to empower the individual, which could mean many, many individuals, because I put out there the means for any individual to take power into their own hands and creative power, so that the individuals who are waking up would be prone to doing very good and effective things that change things for the better in some way. That's what I do. So
Thank you for your answer. That's pretty much the way I see it too. Yes, I see it sometimes as like a merger of like the libertarian movement in a political way and the spiritual movement and the truth movement. And sometimes I see that one of these is very ignorant or of the other, or it's very judging. But when it all comes together, all these three things, I think it's very much about sovereignty, what you say, and using one's own creativity, and being aware of a lot of schemes that are being foisted upon humanity in many ways. And this comes, I feel, together in many ways with people right now. We're also tired of dogmatic things too much, who want to evolve organically and with sovereignty. I think I just feel when I see the people around me that this is the kind of track they're getting onto more and more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me give you an example from the past. Let's see if I can remember this. For people that don't know, I've worked as a reporter for 35 years now, investigative reporter. So we haven't really talked much about that at all here. But the first book I wrote in 1988 was called AIDS Inc. And it was a intense exploration of the medical research behind what was being called AIDS. Was it truthful research? Was it good research? Was it incompetent research? Was it politically biased research? All kinds of questions came up. And my conclusion at the end of it was that HIV had never been proved to cause anything, period. And that was not some conclusion that I came to lightly. So, somehow or another, flash forward, I guess, a few years or whatever it was, I was invited by a group in Los Angeles to give a talk about this. And this was an atheist group. That's what they were. They had some name, I can't remember what it was, that identified them as atheists. And that was, what they talked about. That was their philosophy, whatever. All of that was the focus of the group. So as soon as I stood up and started talking, I realized that all the people there were, looking more and more disgruntled as I continued to lay out the case that I made in my book. And I don't think I brought it up during the talk because these were in the early years, let us say, when I didn't have as much experience as I do now. But I realized at some point what was going on. Because they were atheists, they had, quote, a deep and firm and abiding belief in science, end quote. See, that was the solution. That was the grand solution, sort of, to humanity's problems. But they were unable to differentiate between pseudoscience and real science. So they considered, just off the cuff, that whatever the science establishment or the medical establishment was saying about AIDS and HIV had to be true because that was science, right? So therefore, for me to begin to not only question but heavily criticize in my usual sarcastic way, point by point, the insane research that led up to saying that HIV caused AIDS was me attacking science. That was their bias. That's the lens that they were looking through as I spoke. And that's why they were pissed off and not happy at all. So there's a case, you see, where something enters into these groups. That's just an example of one. They develop their own bias, their own prejudice, their own whatever, their own point of view, you could call it. But from that point of view, that's going to give birth to a number of blind spots where they can't think straight, where they can't look at what is being put in front of them. They're always going to see it through that particular lens in general terms, not specific terms, just kind of, well, this is the enemy, that kind of thing, right? And this is what happens to most of these groups. And that's why they don't really get anywhere. They don't really expand. They don't make a real difference, not the kind of difference they would like to make. So, yeah, there's all kinds of crazy stuff happening in that way. And it's too bad, but that's just the way it is. So, but the individual, on the other hand, there is an opportunity there for the individual to wake up to what's going on in the world, and then also to wake up to his own creative power, his own imagination, and do something about that and with that. That to me is very real.
All right. I think this is a good final note.
Yes.
And Maybe you can tell people how to reach you.
Sure.
Or your stuff.
nomorefakenews.com. That's my website. It connects to articles on my blog. You can read about my collections, 3 Matrix collections there. I write articles almost every day. So there are many new articles coming out on a variety of subjects. And you can also sign up for free email list there. nomorefakenews.com.
Okay. So I also have to strongly recommend to people to check out at least one of your Matrix collections, because it's like really mind-blowing, mind-opening. And we only covered about 1% now.
Yeah, I know. But it was a good 1%.
Yeah. And thank you a lot, John, for taking time for doing this.
Thank
with
you.
me here.
Thank
And
you.
Chris.
And thank you, both of you. I appreciate it. Good talking with you.